The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, it's Trish here. I hope you're all doing well. I see we've got several names that I recognise from a whole lot of places around the world. If you'd like, you can type into the chat box for me where you're actually listening to this from to give everybody an idea of how broad our audience is here. Okay, I got a Brisbane, I got a Perth, New Zealand, Western Australia, Sydney. I've recognised some names from over in Europe as well, so it's certainly quite a geographic spread today. So it's just gone the start time. I'll actually give it another couple of minutes just for people to connect in. We like to give people those extra few minutes in a webinar just in case they're having any technical difficulties. Oh, we've got someone from Cardiff in Wales. Nice. Another Brisbane. Living in Melbourne, I fear it might be a very long time before I see Brisbane. Those of you in Australia, you'll understand that Victoria's basically been isolated from the rest of the country due to COVID. Ah, someone from Aberdeen in Scotland. Welcome. Beautiful city I've had the pleasure of visiting a couple of times now. Okay. We might actually get started now then. And we might still have a few other people join us as we progress forward. So thank you for joining us today. This is one of the continuing series of webinars that the iChemie Safety Centre has been presenting to try and make sure that we keep process safety front of mind during the current pandemic situation that's occurring. We believe it's very important to not only be able to keep people focused on process safety, but also to make some resources available for people so they can access them at this time as well. Hence our series of free webinars. My name is Trish Kerrin, and I'm the Director of the iChemie Safety Centre. The topic for today's webinar is applying process safety during the concept select stage. And you'll see here on the screen that we actually have the cover of a guidance document we released earlier this year. This webinar is going to work our way through what's in that guidance document and potentially how to apply it. It's important always to acknowledge our Safety Centre member organisations. These are the organisations that fund us to allow us to do the work that we do, and we're very grateful for their support that we have. They're from all over the world, as you can see. So if you're in one of those member companies and you're not aware that you're in a Safety Centre company, feel free to reach out to us. And if you're not in one of those member companies and you'd like to be, then reach out to us and we'll see if we can work with you to have you join up with the Safety Centre. Importantly, we also work a lot with universities and regulators from around the world as well. And this is because we want to help universities to improve the process safety education so that we get better qualified engineers coming to us at the very start of their career, where they've had a little bit of experience and understanding in process safety. Now, when we talk about process safety in the Safety Centre, we're talking about a model that we like to use where we focus on leadership as being a core part of process safety, but it's that leadership across a range of different areas in an organisation. There's knowledge and competence, engineering and design, systems and procedures, assurance, human factors, and culture. Now, this particular webinar is working in the topic of engineering and design. So all the work we do in the Safety Centre sits somewhere within one of those areas, and this one is squarely within that engineering and design part. So back in earlier this year in 2020, which it seems so long ago and it's only been 6 months, the ISC released a guidance document that we titled Applying Process Safety During Concept Select Phase of a Project. And this document was a project that we'd undertaken over the previous 12 months, where we'd looked at where we could combine the best practices of how to try and embed that inherently safer design concept at the very start of a project so that it had a better chance of lasting all the way through into the operational phase. So this guidance document includes a series of checklists that highlight important areas for consideration. And it also includes some worked examples of using those checklists, so you can see how it potentially can actually be applied in real life situations. But the first thing we need to actually talk about really is what is concept select, and this is a snapshot of a diagram within the guidance document showing the various stages of a project. Now, concept select is that very first stage that we're talking about. This is actually when we decide what sort of thing we're wanting to build in the first place at all. Before we even get down to the idea of doing our detailed engineering and design work. So it might be, for example, do we want to have a manned offshore facility, or an unmanned offshore facility might even be at this concept select stage that we're starting to discuss that. Do we want to have an onshore facility or an offshore facility even? And there's a range of different sorts of activities you can have there. And it's a critical part that then feeds into the front-end engineering and design, as I said, where we start to detail the diagrams that will tell us how our project is going to look. Then we get into our detailed engineering before we eventually go through the whole process of building the facility and then operating it and eventually decommissioning and how we actually go through that particular phase as well. So it sort of sums up that we're looking for the technical development and the different options, and we're going to compare those. And we're focusing on making sure that we've got that concept framed and defined in a clear way, that we then collect the right data we need, and that we have a high-level screening activity at that point. They then funnel down into the end of a concept select stage. We'll actually have a single concept recommended for the particular project to go ahead. We'll define some of the final configuration and start to be able to align the project team to move into the feed stage and further down the process as well. So that's where concept select fits into the process. In terms of what it is, this is around, it's typically finished before the feed stage. Sometimes there can be some overlapping elements in it, though. It's not actually always as clear-cut as the previous diagram may have suggested. But definitely, the concept select stage informs what goes into the feed process, and it's at that point that we can start to develop that very clear scope of what we're after. We then look at incorporating the process safety and inherent safer design principles into that stage. And this is because we actually want to get them right in at the ground floor, get that safety designed in to start with. So, for example, it may well be an inherently safer design, potentially, if we were to have an unmanned facility. So if we can build that right into the design up front, then we don't need to deal with, during an operational phase, having people within that facility for an operational perspective. They'll obviously still need to be there to maintain it at various times, but it does allow us to have that sort of concept engineered through. And that allows us to try and keep it going through that whole life cycle of the project. But it is important to remember, and I will reiterate this towards the end as well, that process safety is not only about getting the design right at the very start, it's actually also about how we operate it, how we maintain it, and how we focus on monitoring our safety systems to make sure they're still working and giving us the outcome that we need to see. So in terms of how to use the guidance document, there's a flowchart and there's some simple steps within that flowchart. So the first thing we want to be doing is determine the scope for how we're going to implement. What sections of the guidance document are actually useful to what you're doing, your application and experience that you've got. We need to define the parameters for consideration. So how are we going to understand what parameters we're working within? Do we already know that we have a particular location or a city selected even? Have we got that far in our parameters at this point? We need to define the inherently safer design principles that we're going to be using. We then will conduct workshop reviews using the checklists that we've got in the document and taking into account how we've embedded those inherently safer design principles at that point. As with any project, it's really important to make sure we understand how the project is continuing. That means the project needs to have metrics and we need to be monitoring the activities that are going on at that point. We then will conduct a form of risk ranking for each of the different concepts, taking into account the process safety implications for making the decision as to which one we're going to choose at the end. And there'll be a whole lot of factors that go into deciding which concept we actually choose. Safety is only one of those factors. Then at the next stage, you'll finalise the deliverables to move on to the stage gate review. This is where you decide whether the project is even going to go ahead at this point. And you have those deliverables that you can make that assessment on. Some of those will be some cost-benefit analysis activities and understanding the payback period for building the particular facility. Others will be what does the facility vaguely look like in terms of some of the overall layouts, the concept that we've chosen. All of that information needs to go into the deliverables package at the end of the project, at the end of that stage of the project. We then need to ensure that the principles of inherently safer design continue to be applied throughout the life of the project. So this is around the idea of keeping a focus on the different aspects that have been designed into a facility. An example here might be, if we considered the Bhopal incident, there were a number of safety devices that were designed into that facility at the very start. When the incident actually occurred, most of those devices had actually been bypassed or disconnected at some point throughout the process. So their flare system was deactivated, their refrigeration system was deactivated, for example, their circulation system was deactivated, they were unable to inject a substance into the reaction to stop it reacting. That had all of these things in the original design and were actually constructed. They were slowly stripped away throughout the process of that particular operation. So that led to the inherently safer design principles that had been put in the first place actually being absent when they were needed. So process safety is not just something that happens at the start of the project. It does have to happen all the way through, including operation and decommissioning. So there's a simple flowchart within the document that takes you through each section of the guidance document and talks about what is important in those sections. So I'll actually take you through each of those sections now, just to give you a little bit of a taste of what's in there, so you can understand whether it's a document that you might find useful in your work and that you might want to take a look at and use. So if we think about the parameters, what is the scope of the project that we're even talking about? What are we trying to do here? You really need to decide what that scope is up front. Are you going to have a chemical facility that manufactures PVC? Okay, that's a scope, so polyvinyl chloride. Now, there's two technologies at this point in time to actually manufacture PVC. There's emulsion and suspension type of a reaction that can occur. So in the concept select stage, you'd actually be looking at, do we want an emulsion plant or do we want a suspension plant? And there are advantages and disadvantages to either particular type of technology to use. So that's one example there in terms of the parameters for consideration. It's also this point where you start to talk about, well, do we want to use conventional technology that we already have and we've used before, or are we going to start to look at novel technology that may still be on the drawing board in terms of concept? Now, you may say, well, we don't know what the novel technology is, so we can't adequately do the risk assessment to understand what we want to do, so we won't take the novel path potentially. A trap that sometimes people fall into, though, when they look at just the conventional is not applying accurate failure rates when they want to calculate their risk that they're likely to see at that point. So we do need to make sure that even though we're talking conventional technologies, that we do have to have accurate failure rates, as accurate as they can be in the work that we do, to really understand whether potentially the conventional technology is actually safer from a failure perspective than the novel. The novel technology will require a series of more deep risk assessment activities to take place in it, but it may well be the path that we go down potentially. Now, the next step was to define the inherently safer design principles to be applied. So just a reminder of what the ISD principles are that we're talking about. So they operate a little bit similar to the concept of the hierarchy of control. A little bit, not quite. But obviously the best principle you can apply is eliminate. Can we actually eliminate the hazard altogether? If we can eliminate the hazard, then we've actually ruled out the risk, that particular risk occurring to us. So that is obviously an inherently safer principle at that point. The next one is substitution. So can we actually substitute something for a less toxic or a less flammable particular chemical, for example, that we might have? Minimization or intensification is another aspect to consider. How can are we talking about minimizing the volume of storage of chemicals on site? As the late Trevor Kletz once said, what you don't have can't leak. So if we can minimize the amount, then we are actually potentially achieving an inherently safer design. Moderation or attenuation. So how do we actually work on moderating the process that we might have? So things like, can we operate at lower temperature or lower pressure, for example? Now, the final one there is simplification. How can we actually make the process simpler? And this is a way that we can focus on trying to reduce the overall complexity that we might have within a particular operation, because everything that we have in a complex situation can go wrong. So how can we actually strip out some of that complexity? This is not about being simplistic, though. It's important to understand. Simplification is not about being simplistic. It's about removing unnecessary while still keeping the necessary in place. Now, the challenge with inherently safer design principles is that sometimes we might actually introduce other hazards by using one of these principles. There is no such thing as something that is inherently safe effectively. What we're looking at is how we can get inherently safer. So if we are, for example, able to operate a reaction at a lower temperature or a lower pressure, what are we trading off to do that? Do we have to use a more reactive chemical potentially that could introduce other hazards? So we do need to make a balanced decision. Inherently safer design principles are not straightforward. They're not just a straightforward, well, this is just what we need to do. This is the safer option. And it's important to keep that in mind. Now, I've just got an example of what one of the tables in the guidance document here. So for example, if we're talking about minimization or intensification, can we reduce the inventory of the hazardous materials? What considerations we should take into account is, are we talking unit operations or continuous operations, batch operations? These can have different safety impacts on what we're doing. So this table just gives you some ideas and some hints around what to think about when we're actually going through this, as well as any further detail that you might want to actually consider in that. So the tables are laid out to try and give you the prompts to think about what might apply in the situation when you're in that concept select stage. There are other considerations that also need to be thought about here, though. So in terms of passive design and layout, are we able to actually achieve that in some way, creating separation distances, for example, to minimize domino effects? The operability. What previous incident history exists for the type of technology that we're looking for? And not only your own local or corporate, but also international. What has happened around the world in this space? Any resourcing considerations? Do you actually have people available to you? The reliability, availability, and maintainability of the type of equipment you're talking. And then the life cycle and end of life. How do you actually transition to the end of life? So for example, again, another snapshot of part of a table here. This one looks at passive design and layout. So how do we separate the people from the hazards? Well, there's a range of different considerations we can look at, and then some further details to go into. So, focusing on the integrity of the containment. So how do we then deal with the joints, the seals, any moving parts, those sorts of things? I once worked in a facility that did have quite a high degree of inherently safer design principles designed into it from the very beginning. So it very much had passive design and layout in it when it was built. So there were things like the storage tanks were geographically separated from the reactors, so they were so far apart that you couldn't get a domino effect. But you still then had to get the product from one end of the plant to the other end of the plant. So there was a pipeline from the tanks through the charge pumps into the reactors. That pipeline was welded. There was no flanges on that pipeline because the flanges were a source of potential leak. So we eliminated the potential leak by having no flanges in that pipeline. Creates other potential issues to deal with. How do you maintain a piece of pipe that you can't take a section out of if it's a long section of pipe? Those sorts of things. But as part of that whole inherently safer design principles, there's all sorts of things that you can build in to try and reduce or minimize some of the impacts that you might see. When it comes time to conduct the review of the workshop, we actually specified in the document that we felt that there was a range of people that needed to be included in the activities. So obviously we need a facilitator. Now this person is similar to a HAZOP facilitator. They need to be trained and competent as a facilitator. They need experience in that. They're the people that are actually making sure the conversations go in the right direction and focus on bringing people together to be able to debate and discuss what needs to be done. You need to have engineering representatives there, and you'll potentially have a range of different engineering disciplines possibly. You will probably have a process engineer there, but you may also need to have instrument electrical as well as mechanical, for example. You should have an operations representative. People that actually understand how to operate one of these plants is very important when it comes to how we design them. Reliability, how are we going to manage the reliability and maintenance of this idea, this concept? A technical safety or process safety representative is important, as is occupational health and safety and environment, because they're actually two different disciplines and they both need to come together to deliver the right safety focus. And lastly, we also felt it was quite important to have a human factors specialist as part of the workshops to make sure you're really creating a very broad quality discussion about the different things you can be doing in this situation. And we also suggest the use of a checklist to prompt the assessment. And this is actually an example of the checklist contained in the guidance document. So it starts by talking about, well, let's talk about the chemical hazards. What do we need to worry about anything to do with this chemical that we might have as part of our different concepts? Means of handling is another example. How are we going to make sure we deal with handling of these products at this point as well? If we now look at how we would define the project metrics, there's a range of different metrics that we've put in as an example in there around things you might monitor throughout the stages of a project. So you'll raise a number of actions potentially during the review workshops. How are you monitoring the closure of any of those actions to make sure the information is fed in the way it needs to be? Are there any overdue actions from those workshops? How are you dealing with the review of current risk versus the defined risk tolerance as the project progresses? So these metrics, some of them will expand beyond the concept select stage into the rest of the stage of the project as well. If we're looking at changes to inventory of hazardous materials from the initial concept, how do we make sure we track what changes have been done? Changing design philosophies as we continue the review. Those sorts of things might actually change as we go through. The resourcing requirements, not only the project, but also the resourcing of operations. So are we selecting a concept that actually significantly changes the number of people that may be needed to operate that facility potentially? And are there any changes that might trigger a change in regulatory approach? So we might want to implement a particular concept or a particular technology, but it requires potentially a lot more flaring to take place. So that might bring in an environmental impact that we hadn't previously thought about. We need to think about any of those changes. These metrics try and help us focus on understanding what we need to be checking. So once you've done that, you'll then go through the process of the risk ranking and understanding that. So the first thing you need to think about is your ranking methodologies, and then you need to think about the quantification and how you actually monitor that. So in terms of the ranking methodologies, you might be using an internal company risk matrix, or there are a number of published documents on various different ranking methodologies. There's Pew's Concept Select, the weighted rating method, Satty's analytical hierarchy, or Roy's Electra 3 as well, are various different models and methods. Now, the guidance document doesn't go into the details of these. It actually refers you off to where you can find more information about them. When it comes to quantification and understanding that, this is where you're starting to look at the hazard studies that you're doing and the 7 stages of a hazard study, which includes some of the quantification activities. You might be using the MOND index or the inherent safety index, which also exists. You might use decision matrices as well to try and determine where you're actually going to go with that particular activity. In terms of then how you define and finalize the deliverables at that next step. So there might be several different deliverables that you will produce out of the concept select stage. So the objective, scope, and design philosophy are pretty standard. You might then have some block flow diagrams or even preliminary layouts. You might not be at the preliminary layout stage though. It might be a little bit early for that. But you should have an understanding of your capacity that you're looking at, inventories and potential feedstocks, any regulatory requirements. You might want to list at that point and define what your further reviews are going to be. You need to understand what the safety critical roles are for the project, and you would document those at that stage as well. You might have some preliminary QRA and conceptualization of the HAS ID at this point in time, although that might occur more in the feed stage. That's one of those ones that could sort of sit in either side. This is probably also a good part, though, to define the basis of safety for what your facility is. And this is about defining some of those various different design and operating philosophies. So things like in the facility that I mentioned earlier, one of the basis of design elements was that there was a physical distance separating the storage tanks and the reactors. That was part of the basis of safety of that facility. Another part of the basis of safety was then all of the occupied buildings were located a further distance away again. And even down to it also had a gradient that sloped away from the reactors and away from the occupied buildings, such that if there was a release of a heavier than air gas, it should, in theory, unless there was a very strong wind in the opposite direction, it should move away from the people. These were all things documented in the basis of design when the concept was raised for this particular project. So I mentioned earlier, it's really important that we make sure we focus on process safety throughout the entire life cycle of the project. So this is making sure that we don't only apply it in the concept select stage, but all the way through to decommissioning, and that includes operations and maintenance on the way. And one of the challenges we often see here is we don't necessarily design for something to be effectively decommissioned at the end. That can result in some significant hazards creeping in that need to be very carefully managed when it does come time to decommission that particular facility. Now, we can't always build that in up front, but we should at least be thinking about when we do have to pull this piece of equipment apart, how can we actually do it? Is it possible to do it and maintain the safety of the personnel involved in doing that? So we do need to make sure that inherently safer design principles and process safety are applied throughout the entire process. This is also when we need to make sure around our organisations that we focus on inherently safer design principles when we're talking about management of change and altering our facilities as well. So if you think about it, when we've got the situation of management of change coming in to change a particular part of the facility, you need to go back to your basis of safety, which has come out of your concept select stage. You really need to understand where the basis of safety started. It will evolve as you go through feed and detailed design, and then even construction as to what is as built there. But if you are making a change, is it going to impact the basis of safety of your facility? And if so, do you truly understand the risk that you're putting in place at that point? So that's why inherently safer design does apply across the entire life cycle of a project. There are also some other great references out there. So the CCPS, the Centre for Chemical Process Safety, last year released a book on guidelines for integrating process safety into engineering projects. Now, they cover the entire project life cycle. The guidance document that we released in the Safety Centre really focused only on trying to get it in at concept select stage. So the CCPS book is quite good if you want to look at the rest of the project life cycle stages and how they actually, how you actually continue to apply process safety all the way through. Now, if you are in the offshore oil and gas business, there is also an ISO standard that does have some useful appendices in there around various different prompts that you should be thinking about when you're actually designing your installation at that point. I'd like to acknowledge the various different participants in the project that pulled all this together. I actually noticed we've got at least one or two of you on the line, actually. So it's really important to acknowledge these are the people that contributed to this document, that tested it, that debated it, and that in the end we reached some level of consensus on what we wrote in this document. You can see there it's quite a wide range of different types of organisations. It includes operating companies. It also includes consultancies that do a lot of this work as well for a living. So it was important to have both sides of the equation there as part of this. So it was fantastic to work with this group of people. At the bottom of the page there is a short link where you can actually go and download this document. It is free. All the guidance documents that the Safety Centre produce are freely available for people to access because we want to make sure that the information is available for people to improve their process safety and raise the bar. I'd also particularly like to thank Chevron in this. Chevron were the project sponsor, and Ryan Cousins was our sponsor in leading us through this project as well. So it was great to have Chevron focusing and leading through this project for us. That was all I had in terms of the slides. I am more than happy now to take any questions that you may have. So if you want to just type them in the questions pane for me, I will get through and answer those questions for you. I hope you found that a useful snapshot of what was in the guidance document. It's never going to be something comprehensive in such a short period of time, and it's important to realise that it is a short summary guidance document for you as well. We try and aim on writing practical guidance documents that you can just take and implement in your organisation fairly quickly. And as I said, the CCPS book has a lot more theory around the entire project lifecycle in it as well. So I'm just waiting for any questions to come in now. Can you please describe more on human performance? Okay, so that's really around how are you bringing into the initial concept the human factors element of it. So how do you focus on trying to make it as easy as possible for the human to get the task right where they need to do a task. So the first part is, can we actually eliminate the need for the human to do a task? That would be the first step that you'd go through. How can we eliminate that? If we can't eliminate it and we still need the human to intervene and do something, if they get it wrong, what are the consequences of that? If someone making a simple mistake is enough to cause a catastrophic consequence in our design work that we're doing, then we've made a mistake in our design work. We need to try and make sure that if a human makes an error, makes a mistake, they can actually recover from it without a catastrophic outcome occurring. So this is where you want to bring in human factors experts to work with you in designing the tasks that the human needs to do, so that we can get them designed in such a way that the human has every chance of getting it done successfully. Things like the interface and the control system that you're using. So how do we make sure we don't overburden the operator with a whole lot of alarms that they actually really don't need to be seeing, because they're not actually going to do anything about them, because they're not actually alarms. They shouldn't be alarms. They're interesting pieces of information the operator might like to know, but doesn't necessarily need to get them at a particular point in time, for example. So making sure you've got your control system designed in such a way that it meets the ergonomic requirements for how humans can interpret and process data. So the screen layouts, the colors used on the screen, the number of alarms that you would expect them to then see during a normal and an abnormal operation situation, and how you'll actually monitor that. Accessibility of equipment. How are you aligning your equipment together? How are you labeling your equipment? Is it possible someone can inadvertently go to the wrong piece of equipment because they happen to turn right instead of turning left? How can you try and prevent that from occurring? And there have been some instances that have occurred. One that springs to mind there is the Formosa Plastics PVC incident that occurred in the US a few years ago, where an operator opened up a reactor that was in reaction and released a substantial quantity of a flammable and toxic substance at that point in time, carcinogenic vapor as well. So it was simply that they were unable to communicate with each other because their means of communication was inadequate. They couldn't see each other, two operators working. One was working on reactor A, the other one started working on reactor B and opened it up inadvertently. So how can you design your system so that you eliminate the chance that that can actually occur, or at least minimize that chance? So that's what you really need to be focusing on in terms of the human performance aspect of it. I hope that helps answer that question. Notice there was a recommendation for human factors specialists to be in attendance at the safety workshops. Where would we find these specialists, and how would you recommend operating companies develop in-house competency in this area? Okay, so there are a number of human factors specialists now that are certainly operating all over the world. You typically will find that they are often ergonomists or psychologists by background. So you need to be looking, this is where you look outside of the engineering fraternity. But there are certainly a number of human factors consultancies that exist in various countries around the world that I know of. So if you were to just literally do a human factors specialist search, you will probably come up with a range in your geography area. In terms of how to develop some of that in-house competency, there are also a number of different operating companies that I know of that have in-house human factor specialists. So either it is by directly recruiting into the organization, or looking at your personnel that you have and upskilling some of them in that particular space. There are a number of training programs around human factors. In fact, IChemE does run one itself. We do have a human factors training program that we run. It runs over a period of 12 months where the candidates come in for short blocks of time every 3 months, and it actually helps them focus on implementing what they're learning. And they usually work on a project throughout that life of the training course as well to practically implement what they're really learning in that space. So that's another way to develop some of the competency in that particular area. Does the guidance document have references like which design code or standard it follows? No, we didn't actually mention those in detail. And the reason for that is, depending on where you are in the world, there will be potentially different standards or different codes that you need to follow. In a lot of the areas and geographies we work in, there are what we call performance-based legislation, which actually means we don't specifically have to follow a particular design code. We actually have to design something that achieves and as low as reasonably practicable safety. So we don't specify particular codes. You may need to either talk to your regulator or look at what other standards are required in your particular geography. We've had someone that's left, but they have left a bit of a message. You mentioned the use of safety indicators in this phase. What is your opinion on the use of sustainability indicators, i.e. environmental, economic, and safety aspects together? Yes, I think that's a very valid point that you raise. I mentioned in one part where you may see a change in regulatory requirements that pop up because you may have done something or changed the design in such a way that it increased the need for environmental regulators to be involved. We tried to keep the document very clearly focused on inherently safer design principles and process safety. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be applied, or the concepts shouldn't be applied in other fields such as sustainability and environment. So is there a better environmental way that you could actually achieve the project or the outcome you're talking about? In fact, in our project groups, we had a lot of debate over which examples we should use, because often some of the examples very much came down to, no, that's actually an environmental example, not a strict process safety example. So we struggled at times to really define very clearly for us what we wanted to see in that space. So I think there's definitely room for looking at other different factors in that space, and would certainly encourage you to think about that as well when you're in that particular phase of a project. And someone said, thanks a ton, very well answered. You're welcome. I'm glad that made sense to you. Are there any other questions coming in? I think I've answered all the ones that have come in so far. Nope, nothing coming in yet. The recording of this webinar will be published on our Safety Centre website. It will also be published on our YouTube channel, IQME Safety Centre, and will be available for you to take a look at over the next couple of days. So please feel free, if you found this useful, please feel free to share it with your colleagues if you think they could get something out of that. And also I'd encourage you to check out some of our other social media channels. We do a range of other activities. We publish little incident videos on their anniversaries to remind you of process safety. They're all on our Safety Centre YouTube channel, as well as we push them out through all of our social media feeds at that time as well. Technical safety specialist, could I describe it more? So that is typically what's going to be your process safety. And we did have a little bit of a debate there. Do we call it the process safety specialist or do we call it the technical safety specialist? You actually may have different technical safety specialists depending on what you're actually looking at. So if you're working and focusing on chemical reaction activities and trying to decide something in that space, your technical safety specialist may well be a process engineer with a lot of experience in reactivity. If you're actually focusing on understanding how you might apply your control systems and what safety systems you might install, you may then be looking at a functional safety specialist, because they will be the people that will have more knowledge and understanding of how you actually design and apply the various different safety shutdown systems, for example, what safety integrity level, what safety instrumented systems you're looking at putting in. So it actually really depends on specifically what hazard and what focus you're looking at the time. And that's why we didn't define it further in than that, because we said, well, it could be a range of different types of specialists that are needed at that point in time. Okay, just wait and see whether there's any other questions. Another one, excellent, thank you, much appreciated. You're welcome. Glad you enjoyed it. Okay, if there's no other questions, then I might bring the webinar to a close. Just as a reminder, IQME have a series of other webinars occurring at this point in time. In fact, tomorrow we're doing a webinar on a panel session with a range of different contributors. I'll be one of those, and we'll be talking about risk assessment and general response to the COVID pandemic situation, how we're managing risk assessment. So if you're interested, then you'll be able to find links to register for that on the IQME website, www.iqme.org. And then on the 17th of July, I will be doing a webinar on why training is not enough when it comes to competency. And you can connect into that if you go to the Safety Centre website, and there's an events tab where you'll be able to register in for that particular webinar if you're interested in that. And one of our participants from the development of the document said this was an interesting project to work on. Thank you, Trish. And good overview. If you're happy to have the link, have sent LinkedIn requests. No worries. Thank you for that as well. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll leave you to get back to your evenings or mornings or middays, depending on where you are in the world. Please stay safe, and I look forward to you attending another one of our webinars shortly. Thank you very much.